Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Yes. Welcome to Hybernská. My name is Štěpán Vizi. I will be moderating this evening tonight, and welcome to the Cafe Collaborations on Transatlantic Relations in a Turbulent Era. We have some special guests with us, but first of all, let me please welcome Mr. Tomáš Vokáč, the director of Campus Hybernská, to welcome you all here. Please, the floor is yours.
Welcome. Good evening, Your Excellency, dear colleagues, dear guests. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you here at Campus Hybernská, which is a special place which is built by Charles University and the municipality of Prague. I hope you'll be enjoying the discussion with our great distinguished guests from the Embassy of Canada on the topic of transatlantic relations in a turbulent era, which we have not only in Europe but in the USA, a neighbor of Canada. So I'm looking forward to your discussion and welcome, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. As mentioned, we'll be discussing about the transatlantic relations and about the challenges. And as you probably know, there are many. And to discuss those, I am very pleased to welcome here Her Excellency Emily McLaughlin, the Ambassador of Canada to Czechia. Welcome. Emily McLaughlin joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 2001, and since then she has held many positions, including the departmental advisor in the Office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She also served at the Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York, the High Commission in the UK, and also the Consulate General in Hong Kong. Most recently, she was the director of the Inter-American Affairs Division at the Ministry, and since August 2023, she has been the Ambassador of Canada to Czechia. So, welcome. And a bit further to my left, I'm very happy to also welcome Jan Hornáth, who is the head of Department of North American Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Charles University. He also works as researcher at the Peace Research Center Prague and focuses on American foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region, transatlantic relations, and international relations in general. He has been he has earned in 2023. He was a scholar of the Fulbright Scholarship at the School of Public and International Affairs at the North Carolina State University, and last year also served as Europe and America Fellow at the University of Regensburg. So welcome as well. Right, just so that you know what to expect, we have about 90 minutes for the discussion. The first half, roughly, I will ask the speakers questions, but for the second part of tonight, there will be plenty of space for you to ask questions as well, so you can think about them already in advance. And I hope we will have a lively discussion with everyone involved. And yeah, so to kick us all off, I would say I sent a kind of a provocative thesis to both of the guests based on a commentary in The Guardian that was published a few weeks ago by Italian political scientist Natalie Tocci, who argues that, or the commentary is called Trump or No Trump, Europe's relationship with the US will never recover. And she claims that the transatlantic relationship can no longer be assumed to be based on shared values and identities. So my question is, do you agree with this statement? And if not, what can we make sure that the relationship is recoverable? And if you do agree, what is the way forward now? So, Your Excellency, please.
Good. Start me with an easy one. Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much for having me here. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here to speak with you and to be able to discuss this. certainly transatlantic relations are very topical these days. I do, if I could make a small observation before I go to your question, it struck me when I first moved here 2 years ago that the word transatlantic in the minds of most people here seemed to mean Europe to the US. And I was always like, well, hang on a minute. I'm pretty sure I also flew over the Atlantic Ocean to get here. You know, good, bad, or indifferent, I think now that realization is shifting a little bit here, where the word transatlantic maybe doesn't simply mean the Europe-US relationship. There is a recognition of other countries inhabiting that continent on the other side of the Atlantic. So I'm from one of those countries. So first of all, to come back to your question. So, you know, I think right now we are experiencing not a transition, but a rupture. It's a rupture in the rules-based order, and I think it aligns actually with the statement that you shared. For us, you know, we're saying, okay, how does a middle power, how does Canada deal with a situation where the rules-based order, which we have relied upon for so long, is eroding? There are power rivalries that we're seeing. There are authoritarian models hardening around the world. You know, first of all, we prospered under the old system. It worked for us. We pursued what we had called a values-based foreign policy. We did that with the Czechs quite a bit, actually. It was anchored in this lovely rules-based multilateral system where we had these large institutions that were sort of helping us move a lot of these global issues forward. There was an open financial system. Okay, there have been some problems in the financial system in the last 20 years. I acknowledge that. We had collective security anchored in NATO, in NORAD for us in North America. In Canada, we have what we would call enviable geography, maybe not so much anymore, but, you know, we had privileged access to the world's largest economy. We had sort of protection from a geographic point of view from a lot of the conflicts going on around the world in various states, and we were sort of distanced from a lot of threats. I think we also had an expectation in how we worked in this system that working with more authoritarian non-market regimes, that they would eventually coalesce towards this idea of democracy and values-based systems and, you know, open societies, free markets, that this would people would come to us. There was an expectation that this progress would happen. Things have changed. I don't think, well, I heard convergence of these values has proved elusive. I think that's a little bit of an understatement. You know, that's not what we're seeing anymore. And certainly the economic strategy of the United States has changed. They're moving far more to a transactional bilateral approach versus a multilateral system that they had before. And we're also seeing a lot of issues within the multilateral system itself. Reduction in the impact and even participation of some countries. So that's sort of the depressing scene setter, I guess. But, you know, what is the way forward, to come to your question? For us, you know, we think Canada can thrive in this environment. And why? It seems like an odd statement, but there are 3 reasons for us. You know, we have what the world wants. So right now we're in transactional mode. We are an energy superpower. We have a lot of it. 85% of our energy is clean, and we are shifting into a direction where we can export more of that. We have critical minerals. We have 5 of the top 10 supplies in our country. You know, we have very interesting supplies of critical minerals that are being looked at more and more. We're not just natural resources. We're one of the world leaders in AI and innovation. We have some of the biggest research institutions and some of the most we're one of the biggest producers in volume of AI computing and quantum talent in the world. We also have capital. We have incredibly strong pension funds who are major infrastructure investors. So we're coming at this in a way where we feel like we have things that are valuable still on the world market. And speaking of values, we still have values, and we think that there are still those in the world who aspire to work with us and who support those values. We're a pluralistic society. We're diverse. We're open. We have open public discourse. It is, It's broad, it's engaged, it's loud, and we don't all agree, but we have the ability to speak publicly. And finally, we're also, and we'll talk a little bit about climate change lately, we're a country that's committed to sustainability. We still see this as an incredibly important component. So it's not a transition. It's not gradual. It's a complete rupture. We recognize, I think the final thing I would say is we recognize that this is happening. We see this happening. We've acknowledged it. I think maybe we were one of the first to be hit with some of these real impacts of this. And, we're committed to making it work and to working with our partners. And I'll quickly say there's sort of three ways we want to meet this challenge. One is really more domestic. It's building our own strengths at home. The other way is building resilience by diversifying abroad, and that's something that we're working very hard on in our embassy network. And then we're also looking to defend values and pursue our interests with our partners around the world, and that includes countries like Czechia and groups like the EU who want to work with us more. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of the Canada mentality right now, I would say.
Thank you very much. And same question to Jan Hornát.
Thank you, Szczepan, and thanks for putting this together. And it's a privilege to be here and speak to you. So going back to Natalie Toki's assessment, I would probably be a little bit more optimistic. I wouldn't agree that no longer can the Europeans and the Americans say that they share values and identities. The whole transatlantic relationship, which includes Canada, from my perspective, of course, was based on this idea of shared values and shared identities. And that was always used historically to smooth over some difficult political and trade problems that have been in the transatlantic relationship in the past, right? It was always something to fall back on that unites us. And the reason that was used both rhetorically and diplomatically is that values and identities have some form of stickiness, right? They stay. It's not like you can, swipe them away with one administration, for instance, and tariffs, right? So if I stick very much to what you mentioned, Szczepan, no longer having shared values, no longer having shared identities, I would doubt. And with my, conversations with American colleagues, with American people, not just academics, but people on the street, they still stick to the same kind of values and identities, the kind of ones we shared in the past, and that have bound the transatlantic societies together. This is not going away with one administration. However, that one administration can really recalibrate the way we define those values and those identities, right? So I think, I will have an evasive answer and say, as I will say to a lot of other questions, that it's perhaps too soon to tell. I am optimistic in the sense that really the values that we have been talking about, values of democracy, values of open societies, values of free speech, all of that, that stays and sticks. And I have trust in the American population that at some point, there will be a reversal from what is currently happening, right? And there will be backlash against that in preservation of the values which that society has cherished for a long time, but also aberrated from in certain periods of its history. So I would probably start on an optimistic note in the sense that I see this as an era of recalibration of the values and the identities. Of course, that recalibration might have negative consequences, and that is what we want to avoid. But the way forward for the transatlantic relationship, I would sign on to the words of Her Excellency, but also underpoint underpin the fact that I think in Europe, what we need to do is kind of depoliticize the relationship. I think we do tend sometimes to make very quick judgments over what is happening in the United States, and those judgments are very based on politics and not so much on a willingness to cooperate, right? So this is not. I do not want to excuse, of course, some issues that are happening in the transatlantic relationship and in the United States, but I think politicizing the transatlantic relationship in this sense is not helpful, right? And the Trump administration is also, should do its fair share of depoliticizing, like thinking out of the context of some kind of a culture war that is happening not just in the United States itself, but the Trump administration sees that this cultural war is happening in the whole of the West and the transatlantic relationship. And Europe seems to be on the opposite side, according to the Trump administration, of the culture wars, right? And of course, this is problematic because the underlying values, right, and the identities, they're still there. They're still shared. We still have the thoughts that are, coming from the long history of the Enlightenment, which then, feeds into what we today call liberalism or classical liberalism. And those are the thoughts of democracy, of the sovereignty of the individual, of the necessary protection of the individual and the minorities against the majorities. These basic democratic principles that merit the fact that we call ourselves liberal democracies, they still stand, right? But we must not forget about them and talk about them. Right?
Thank you very much. Maybe just a quick follow-up question. I have already a lot of questions, but based on what you said about depoliticizing the relationship, do you think it is possible from the European side to do that when the American side is actively politicizing the relationship, pursuing those culture wars, and not just the Trump administration? I mean, people like Elon Musk also trying to influence elections in Europe and things like that. So do you think it's possible?
Look, I have the luxury of being an academic, and I can be an idealist, right? And throw these very big, lofty ideas into thin air and hope that they materialize somehow. Of course, depoliticizing is problematic, particularly when you have the Trump administration, as you mentioned, kind of targeting and calling out Europeans for various issues, right? For Europeans not respecting, free speech, this is where we diverge in a way on the values. I'm saying, we still cherish free speech, but we don't understand what free speech actually is, right? And that's because the issues of free speech are being politicized. They're no longer that kind of procedural aspect of a democracy, right? But we are politicizing free speech in itself, right? So, and I think that's what we're also doing here, with our domestic issues. So, I think it is possible. I think it is possible when we kind of zoom in on, what do we want to preserve from the transatlantic relationship? So we work on those aspects and preserving those and trying to depoliticize those, that we do work with the Trump administration no matter what, because this is an issue that's important to us, and we kind of compartmentalize. But I think even like the political and the public reaction to the election of Donald Trump in the first term was much more politicized than it is today. I don't know if it's a good sign or a bad sign, because what we are probably witnessing is the normalization of these aberrations from the values that we share, right? And that's also problematic. And this leads to what I mentioned earlier, the stickiness of the values. But when, you have more and more aberrations from these values, right? You don't stick to them anymore, and you normalize them, society gets used to the politicization of free speech, then that's the problem. And that's when we start drifting apart in the values.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador, if you want to react to that, if you have any reaction, and second, if you see also this need for depoliticization maybe in the Canada-US relationships, or is it different than the EU-US kind of relationship or situation?
I mean, I'm not someone who can quite picture how to depoliticize because I'm so deeply embedded in the politicization of what we do. I mean, it's for me. I don't know if you can separate. I think I understand where you're going with that, but I struggle to see how you can depoliticize relationships between political leaders. I mean, it just seems like that's sort of fundamentally what's there. So when we're talking about relationships, government to government is a little different. Certainly people to people is a completely different conversation. But when you're talking about relationships between leaders, I mean, of course they're political. Our Prime Minister is in the White House right now, and the leader of the opposition in Canada is at home, you know, saying, oh, he's going to be ineffective and he's not going to get anything. I mean, this is all politicized. So I think I'd have to sit through maybe a little more of your lecture to understand where it is. For me, my brain is wired to just look at it from the political machinations. So I think it's just hard for me from where I sit with my huge bias to see it. But certainly at the, you know, below that kind of political leadership level, I could see exactly how that would actually be helpful. I think, unfortunately, a lot of issues are being pushed into politicized. You know, they're being politicized more and more these days, and that's challenging for certainly, you know, people to manage when you have all this all this information coming at you, and you're trying to understand what it all means. So. But that's a whole huge discussion on, you know, social media and information and disinformation, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
Maybe if I can just specify what I mean by the politicization. Again, I think within the transatlantic relationship, we have always had these kind of fights over various issues, trading issues. There have been trade wars between the Europeans and the Americans since the 1960s. There have been, you know, issues regarding the burden sharing, insecurity. But a lot of these issues have been solved, let's say, by diplomats and politicians, sort of in the back rooms, let's say, right? But now they're being, you know, flaunted and politicized out, right? Like the Boeing Airbus kind of dispute. That is something that, you know, this is something that working groups from both sides sit together and try to work it out, or they go to the WTO and work it out. And this doesn't really, let's say, you know, reach the public, right? But now you have political leaders using that, right, as an instrument in this fight between, let's say, the Europeans and the Americans, right? So you're taking topics that would otherwise be dealt with on a working level, right, without a level of politicization and jargon and rhetoric and whatnot, and you're taking those out into the public and making the public engaged in this, right, and demonstrating the problems on those issues.
So we should just let diplomats do our jobs in the background. Problem solved. I love it.
Yes, to a certain extent, yes, at this point.
Yeah. Okay, so we have the first conclusion. That's good. And yeah, maybe one more point on this article that I mentioned in the beginning, because for Natalie Toci, who wrote the commentary, basically the two ways out for Europe are: the better option is basically a world of transactional relations, which is something that you already described is somehow like happening at the moment, or we are heading in that direction in the transatlantic relationship. The worst option is basically a world of powers or superpowers where this is basically based on extortion, or not really transactional relations, but basically a world dominated by superpowers like the US, Russia, and China, and the rest has to somehow deal with that situation. Do you see that as a danger, perhaps, both of you? And do you see a way how maybe EU and Canada can also cooperate on this to kind of avoid the worst case scenario?
Look, I mean, I like to sleep at night, so I try not to always think about worst case scenarios, but of course that's one. Maybe it's overstating a little, though, to think that we're only going to shift to these sort of through 2 or 3 global hegemonic autocratic superpower type structure. I don't know. I want to believe in the will of the people at some point and other countries being able to come together. And I think that's, when I'm speaking about Canada wanting to work on shoring up some of our relationships that are, more on the values-driven side of things, that is about working with the EU and with other middle powers, with emerging economies on some of these values that are also critical. And they're not just critical because it's nice to do, like democracy and human rights and sustainability. They also have economic benefits. So you can also make the economic arguments for it. I feel like there are still enough voices of moderation out there. They're not as loud. They might not be as sexy and clickbaity, but there's still a lot of countries out there who are speaking to each other, who are trying to work together. There are still functioning multilateral institutions, for now, that are helping to shore this up. There are still rules. We are still in a rules-based order, despite many ignoring the rules. So I don't know. I don't want to be too pessimistic. I feel like, sure, that's a worst-case scenario, but I would hope that some sort of braking mechanism will come in before we get there. If not, yeah.
Yeah, I am a big believer in the virtues of what academics like to call liberal internationalism, which basically says, if we have states that are interdependent economically, embedded in the rules-based order, then we decrease the probabilities of war because of these interdependencies, and that's generally the paradigm that has been undergirding the rules-based order after the Second World War, right? Increasing interdependencies among states through trade, through people-to-people contacts, opening up the borders for people to move, for capital and products to move around, and that creates the interdependencies, and that's something that can cause in itself, it can cause peace. This country has had its fair share of great power politics. It has its fair share of transactional politics and beggar thy neighbor policies in the interwar period. And they have always been very dysfunctional for small states, right? So us as a small state, we need to push towards a multilateral order, an order that is based on interdependencies, because that is something that can assure our existence and our safety. And this is what worries me. If the trend continues and if it spills over, that states become more protectionist, more enclosed in themselves, as the United States under the Trump administration currently is to some extent doing, then we are dropping this grand idea of liberal internationalism and what kind of peace interdependence brings. And that's dangerous for the world. It's dangerous, perhaps not for the Americans, it's not dangerous for the Chinese, but it's dangerous for us, small states, and perhaps even the middle powers. But as the ambassador said, there's a lot of small states and a lot of middle powers, right? The Southeast Asian states have very similar thinking behind of how they want the international system to function, again, along the lines of interdependence, along the lines of multilateralism. So I trust that there are enough potential alliances, right, that small states and middle powers can foster in order to preserve the levels of interdependence, right? Some would call it globalization, and globalization is that stigmatizing term these days. But I prefer the term interdependence because that sort of doesn't have these political connotations. So, so back to that, these worst case scenarios. There are many actors that do not want to, enter this kind of a world of transactionalism and great power politics. To what extent they will be able to serve as a hedge against that, that's the question. But I think in quantity, right, there is power, and if all these smaller actors unite around that, if they create their own mechanisms of trade and rules-based trade amongst themselves, I think very well that we can preserve the type of rules-based interdependent order that was created and so much benefited, as Ambassador said, both middle powers and smaller states.
Thank you. So maybe let's move away from the bleak outlooks or potentially bleak outlooks towards what you mentioned, and that is coalitions and international cooperation. So I guess one could also argue, and you also touched upon it, that this may be also an opportunity for the EU and Canada to work together, to work more closely together. Where do you see the most fruitful areas or the biggest potential for closer cooperation between in the EU and Canada?
Well, the potential is huge. That's a very big question. We have a shared history. We do have a lot of shared values. We have very good relationships already with both the EU, but also with EU member states and with other countries in Europe who are not members of EU or former members of the EU. So, I think we're coming at it from a good space already. We already I would say we already know how to speak to each other. We understand the basics of the doing business. And this is potentially, I say this only because when we're looking at other new markets, there are probably bigger barriers at this point in terms of learning some of the general how to do business in an X country that's more unfamiliar. So we have a lot in common, and that's a good base. We also already have a lot of institutional frameworks that allow us to speak to each other. But what can we do? Well, I could look at a number of different things. So if we look at the security aspect, we cooperate very closely with our European partners on the response to Ukraine. So this has been something that Canada has been engaged in, right from the beginning. We have a very large Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. It's something that is close to our hearts. We also believe in territorial integrity and sovereignty and the rule of law. So, for us, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was, illegal. There's no excusing it. And we've been providing a lot of support. We do that through NATO. We do that now. We're very active in this coalition of the willing. So we've talked about providing security guarantees. We coordinate sanctions packages. So in advance of the EU going out or the US or UK or others, our sanctions experts are speaking to each other. So there's a lot of that kind of multifaceted coordination on support for Ukraine, as well as, humanitarian needs, reconstruction needs, etc. So that's one, I would say, bundle. We are also, staying on the security theme, we're in very active discussions with the EU around defense, all these new defense procurement requirements, defense and security. So if you don't know, there's now a requirement for NATO members to spend 5% of GDP on defense. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details, but 5% of our GDP is quite a lot. So we're looking at opportunities. So we're speaking with the EU as an institution, but we're speaking also to individual countries to figure out, okay, well, what are your capability needs? Where are your gaps? What resources do you need? What are you going to buy? What are ours? So it's a little bit transactional, but it's sort of exploring okay, Canada, we have a lot of capacity in AI. The modern warfare is evolving. There's a lot of drones used. There's certainly an AI component. There's integrating technologies involved. Who needs what we're making? How can we kind of plug that into the European system to help with that collective security guarantee that we've all committed to as NATO partners? So that's a large, one very big example, I guess, is the defense security Ukrainian component. There's also the CETA agreement, which we have in place, which is a comprehensive economic and trade agreement, which I'm happy to speak to as well. I don't want to go on so long, but there's a lot of different ways we work together. I would also flag the G7 because we're president of that this year, so I have to, otherwise I'll be fired. I'm kidding. But we're working with, in the G7, of course, you have European members, but there's the European Commission always comes along as sort of a quiet eighth member as well. So there's a lot of conversations we're doing on that sort of global commons issues as well that we're looking to address. And the EU, but EU member states are such natural partners for us. And not only just sort of the big two or big three. We also, we really want to work with some of the middle-sized countries as well, because we have those commonalities, as you were saying before.
Yeah, I mean, it is a big question, so I'll just pinpoint some issues. So Canada has always been very strong in co-building the rules-based international order. It has been at the forefront of the establishment of the ICC and the International Criminal Court, a very important actor in establishing the norm of responsibility to protect, which is an important norm for international security and human security, right? And if the European Union wants to be an actor on the international scene, we always speak about this EU actorness, right? Being able to impose, let's say, or upload its values onto the international sphere. Well, it hasn't been really good at that in the last few years with regards to the Trump administration, right? If it wants to position itself as the protector of the rules-based order, of the liberal international order that I was speaking about, it hasn't been really good at that, right? And maybe we can work with Canada and its capacities, which are much, let's say, smaller in the sense of, just the demographics and the representation of individual member states and their diplomats at the UN, etc. This is certainly something that the EU can work on, right? Further strengthening what is left of these liberal international aspects of the order that we live in. So that is, let's say, a soft issue, but it's very important. It's very important that someone carries these things forward when the United States is pulling out of international organizations like UNESCO, World Health Organization, the WTO is stuck, right? You need actors that come in and say, okay, so what do we do with this situation, right? And I am sorry to say that I don't see this from the European Union, right? Or to the extent that the EU positions itself to be the protector of this order, it doesn't do the homework, right? We don't have very specific proposals from the EU on how to reform, for instance, the WTO and other organizations. It doesn't react to the fact that the EU, that the United States is leaving these UN organizations, these key UN organizations. So even though it's soft, you might say it's symbolic to do this work. Canada has been good at it historically, and certainly, if we join forces, or at least Canada can kind of prop and teach the Europeans on how to do that. And so this is just one of the kind of value sector. And of course, security, one thing that is also important, and it wasn't mentioned, the Arctic is becoming much more, let's say, problematic and tense. Canada has very similar interests, like countries like Denmark and Norway in the region, upholding again the international order through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, right? Making sure that what is current international law stays international law and is applied in that region. Of course, that calls for a smaller coalition of states, those who are interested, through the Arctic Council, but that involves also European states like Denmark, which has not just issues with, its continental shelf up in the Arctic, but also with Greenland, for instance, and the U.S. aspirations to do whatever with Greenland. So there's so much avenues for cooperation, and probably not enough capacity to follow through on all of these potentials. But yeah, we shouldn't be forgetting Canada. And you're right, when you said, when we here in Europe, especially in the center of Europe, think of transatlantic relationship, the first thing that comes to mind in the mental map is the American flag and not the Canadian one.
Okay, I think we are slowly approaching the time for your questions, but I would like to ask one final question before we do that. I still have many, but I want to make sure that I ask this one because it's about climate policy, which is actually my background, so I wouldn't want to miss that. And you already mentioned that Canada has a lot to offer in that respect when it comes to critical minerals, but also clean energy and so on. And we have been observing kind of an anti-green agenda from the Trump administration in the last months. Do you see this as do you see this more as a threat to the global climate policy, or do you see it also as perhaps an opportunity for Canada or for the EU to become even more of leaders in this kind of respect and to use this opportunity?
I think it's a challenge, it's a threat, but it's also an opportunity. You know, most of these things are not black and white. So, you know, I think it's always, you know, when the U.S. is a huge player economically, but also in terms of their weight on the world stage. And you know, when they withdraw from a space, it leaves a gap, and it's not a gap that's easy to fill. We saw this as well when they removed so much funding to USAID, and you know that really has impacted the way in which many countries are able to provide development assistance abroad, because we were partnering with the Americans and we were using their economic heft as well to carry some projects through. So, but it is also an opportunity. I think it's a chance for others to pick up, you know, the parts that are important, and I think that this is where, again, I come back to the point about working with sort of what we call like-minded, with countries that are still focused on these issues, climate change and sustainability, and work with them on moving forward. You know, there's a lot of work that's already been done. We don't have to abandon the Sustainable Development Goals just because. You know, it's regrettable, for example, that the Americans have pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but on a bilateral basis, we haven't stopped talking to them about clean air and clean water and things, because we share those things. You know, we share lakes and rivers and air, and so it remains even a priority for them, despite some of the rhetoric coming out of the White House. So I think the other thing to remember is, you know, there are other players in the world. We're talking about Europe and US and Canada specifically, but Brazil is hosting COP30 in a month, I guess, in November. That's a big economy. It's a big country. They have a lot of power. They're very politically connected. We invited the president to the second day of the G7 Leaders Summit in June, and a lot of that, the reasoning for that and the conversation was around aligning G7 priorities and the COP30 priorities and ensuring that we're kind of working on those together. So there are many platforms in which we can engage. I mean, I've only mentioned a few, but I think that's a way in which, even with the gap, we can still advance on some of these things. You know, I would also say there are some unusual partners out there that you might not think. So Canada actually works quite closely with China on climate change and sustainability. Not probably the first partner you would think of. For us in particular, we've had some really complicated relations with China in the last 8 to 10 years, but we, on their behalf, we hosted one of the COP, the biodiversity COP, a couple of years ago in Montreal, because they weren't able to in China. We with the EU, so EU, Canada, and China co-host a ministerial meeting every year, which is a follow-up to the Paris Agreement, and is also planning for the next COP. So, you know, I guess I would say all is not lost. There are partners out there who actually still that we are working with, or we're trying to advance some of these priorities, and we just have to keep on, you know, trying to find people with whom our interests align. You know, I think I remember President Pavel saying this, yes, I'm name dropping, at an event a year or so ago, where he said, you know, democracy and working with others doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree on everything, but you have to find partners where you have interests that align and then work with them on those. And I think it's a very valid point. You know, we can't expect everyone to be the same as us and agree on all issues with us, but where you do agree and align, then, you know, in many cases you can actually work with them and find the space to move forward. And a final note on the Arctic, because I'm glad you raised it. I mean, it's a huge priority for Canada. Our entire defense strategy is now structured around the Arctic. It is with a combination of climate change and security threats. It is a massive priority for us and is an incredibly challenging environment to work in. Our Arctic is not the same as your Arctic, and it's not a competition, but I would say I think like Canada, Greenland, and Siberia have really similar, extreme kind of conditions in these Arctics, whereas your sort of Sweden's and Finland's, and it's still cold, but it's a sort of softer kind of Arctic. So we do work collaboratively. The Arctic Council's complicated. Russia's in it, but Canada's working really closely with what we call the Nordic Baltic 8 now. And hello to Norway over there. And we're working really closely with our partners on both the sustainability climate change piece, but also on defense and security, on protection of culture, traditional livelihoods, etc., because we have a lot of indigenous populations in these areas. So there's, I guess, coming back to my point, there is always someone that you can work with on these issues. It's finding the right partners and the time.
So on the U.S. and climate, the U.S. has never been and positioning itself really as a leader in terms of climate and environmental policies. I think the U.S. was very much, in the back of any initiatives when compared to what's happening in Europe with ecology and environmental protection and all of that. So, so even during the Biden administration, there have been initiatives that were very important and revolutionary for the domestic American system. But when Trump comes in, all of that goes down the drain, even funding for some very unique projects, right? However, the U.S. younger population is interested in these issues. You have individual American states that do have their own initiatives, even though they're now being targeted by the Trump administration to not do those environmental friendly and ecology initiatives. But nonetheless, you have states like California or the whole sort of Western U.S. states that are engaged in these issues, where their voters care about them, where those issues do play a role in local elections and governor elections. So even though Trump might have one position, it's not like the U.S. population, when it goes to vote in 4 years, as the younger get older and they represent a bigger batch of the constituency, the environmental issues will be more relevant politically in the United States. Having said that, however, as was mentioned here, the U.S. leaves a gap on the international scene when it leaves these initiatives, right? And the rhetoric that surround the U.S. leaving these initiatives, saying that these environmental initiatives, global initiatives, weaken the American economy, right? They are the efforts of globalist elites to, pull down the sovereignty of the American people and whatnot. It's all this kind of language. Unfortunately, this language then emboldens, other political actors and movements around the world to do the same, right? And I think we can echo this very much in even the, elections here, the parliamentary elections in this country, where some political parties are using very similar catchphrases as the Trump administration to target the European Green Deal, right, and all of these initiatives. So I think this is the problem of rhetoric, where the Trump administration is giving cues to political parties in Europe and other parts of the world on how to, take a negative stance and pull out of these green initiatives, right? And this is what, to your question, whether the EU can be as a leader in climate issues, I think it's going to be more and more difficult for the EU to do that because of these political pressures, right? Because of the political movements that are using similar mechanisms and rhetoric like the Trump administration, being emboldened by what Trump is doing, saying that what he's doing is fine, and the American population is accepting it or whatnot, and then adapting or importing these strategies back home, and thereby, being more, climate skeptic, and making it much harder for the European Union to actually unite around some kind of a climate policy, right? So I think that's because I would still say that the U.S. is in a minority when it comes to how it approaches environmental issues, right? That the rest of the world cares more because they're more impacted or for other reasons. But the problem is that the Trump administration is showing these even like fringe and smaller political movements and parties around Europe and other parts of the world, or of what strategies to take in order to take down and tear down these environmental walls that are hurting our automobile industries and defense industries and whatnot. So then it goes back to the whole issues of trade and protectionism, of how we should protect our industries and not let these international, transnational, globalist agendas, right, that focus on environmentalism and climate change to breach our sovereignty and take away our industries.
Yeah, thank you. So now the time has come for inputs from the audience. First of all, I would maybe like to ask, would you like to react or no?
Maybe, may I ask the first question?
Yeah, maybe if you can introduce yourself.
I'm Vice Secretary for International Affairs at Charles University. My name is Eva Voldřichová-Beránková, and I am a little bit into Canadian studies, but on the level of literature, civilization, and so on. So this is not particularly my topic. May I ask you a question? We have been discussing here about EU-Canadian cooperation and what the challenges are in this new situation of rupture, as you said, or recalibration, as you said. How are you dealing directly with the Donald Trump's administration now? Because I can imagine many diverse ways of cooperating among universities, among diverse institutions, and on a multilateral basis, and so on and so on. But technically, on the daily basis, I wonder what the relations are. Is it like, okay, one day you will be the 51st American state? No, never. But what's how technically do you deal with the administration, and how do you have some recipes or some methods or some ideas how to diplomatically maybe influence something in a more civilized way? Thank you.
Good question. I'm sure it's difficult to answer, but yeah.
Well, there isn't a recipe, or else we would have, enjoyed our meal by now. I think it's a very good question. So it turns out it's a very timely event because my prime minister is in the Oval Office right now. Like right now. I hope he hasn't been thrown out or something.
Yelled at.
So, they're doing the Oval Office with the press, and then they have a lunch, and then they have this. So, we have, I think, in order to understand how we do it, we know the Americans. We've known them for many years. They're our neighbor. It's like, Germany or Slovakia. More than just the leader. We have relationships in the administration, obviously, but there are all sorts of levels of access and conversations, and the Senate and the House of Congress. You also have to remember that there are 50 states who all have a governor. Many of those states border Canada. 32 American states have Canada as their #1 export destination. These people are not happy about the tariffs. The Governor Whitmer of Michigan was just up in Toronto last week, and you can read online. She had very negative things to say about the impacts in America of the tariffs that are happening. So I say that, because this isn't a unifaceted sort of, despite the fact that, yes, he has his hand over the big red button and he is the commander-in-chief, there are others in that administration and at all levels of government who have influence, with whom we engage, with whom we just speak all the time. And our leaders apparently also text each other, and I don't know, be interesting to see what they text back and forth. And we also, on our side, we have, we're a federation. That means that we have 13 provinces and 10 provinces, 3 territories. They all have leaders who also have their contacts at their levels. We have big cities where the cities speak. So you can't think of it as like, one telephone line. You probably don't even know what a telephone line is out there. But it says so. We have so many different points of entry. We haven't taken the approach of kind of rolling over and letting our belly be rubbed. I think we've tried to walk a line, and this is just my observation from, sitting here in Prague, very far away. I think we've tried to walk a line between cooperation, because they are a huge partner, but also drawing a line at our own sovereignty, our national identity, and our own right to make the economic decisions and to put the values to put Canadian interests first. I mean, that's what President Trump does. He puts America's interests first, and so we can also put Canadian interests first without bringing harm to others. So some of it is about trying to find that line. We'll see. I guess we'll look back. The academics will look back in 20, 30 years and write us a report card. It's not easy. It's a very mercurial kind of system to be working with. But I would say fundamentally we don't just have one door we knock on. And so it's a very complex and constant conversation happening at all levels.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Yes, there. And for everyone, if you could state your name and
Hello, good
institution.
evening. Magdalena Firtova, I'm a colleague of Jan Horna, and I'm, immediately involved in Canadian issues. So my question would be more maybe tricky, because I would like to descend from rhetorical and aspirational and value-based discussion to more tangible issues like trade and etc. Historically, we've seen that Canada was always claiming, and Canada and EU were really rhetorically best friends for ages and decades, and Canada really tried to divert its trade to European Union from US to smooth and lessen the dependence on US. But it hasn't happened. It was not the case because, of course, the gravity and the gravitation forces of US market, etc. And so realistically, my question would be to you, Ambassador, if you see any, with those turbulence ages area, whether you see a really realistic impact on a trade relationship, because CETA helped a little bit to diversify the trade, but it was not really a huge impact on this. So I would like to hear some positive lessons, if there is a tangible impact, or is it still always only rhetorical and aspirational? Because it was my comment. And second question would be to Jan. I would disagree with you on this hope and optimism on EU transatlantic relationship, because I'm afraid that the generation of veterans of Second World War, war boomers, and etc. The society of US has changed very much, like to Latin America, Asia, etc. And I'm afraid that it's a wishful thinking that we can keep going on with this shared-based value as they used to be. And maybe, hopefully, we will find a new operational level how to reframe it, to make it work even without those shared historical experiences. Right? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I agree with you. For years we've been building these trade agreements, and Canadian exporters have been like, "Great, I'm going to sell this to my neighbor." But I think that has actually changed now. I think you cannot underestimate the impact that the springtime had on the Canadian psyche when it comes to how we feel about our American neighbor. And it was really a blow to us. And I've heard it described by many as a betrayal of your best friend, your neighbor, right? So you now have businesses that maybe before it was always just too convenient to sell to the US, and so now they have two issues. One is that there are very real trade barriers coming into play with the tariffs. And then secondly, we're kind of pissed. We're like, well, come on. Like, we're really nice. We apologize all the time. Like, why are you picking on us? For heaven's sakes. Like, are there not a lot of other places in the world you could pick on? So I think there's a shift. The thing is, it's not easy to suddenly, if you sell, I don't know, I'm trying to think something. Shampoo, that's a stupid example. But if you sell shampoo to the US and it's easy and you've got all your labeling and it's all sorted and you know how to get it there and you've got your supply chain and your distribution, to suddenly have to sell that to Asia or to Europe, it takes time. And we have a lot of, just like the Czech Republic, we have a lot of small and medium enterprises. We have companies that are 10 people or 100 people. So you don't just instantly flip a switch and suddenly enter the EU with your 18 different languages. I think it is. Maybe that number is not quite right, but all your labeling requirements, all of your importers, getting the shipping figured out. Someone wants to buy it. You've got to get shelf space. It's complicated stuff. So I think the will is there more than ever. I think certainly from a government perspective, we're here to open the doors as much as we can, but you do need the companies to kind of come to that and be able to make the step into the market. So, a lot of what we're doing here on a very sort of granular day-to-day basis is trying to connect Canadian companies with Czech companies and help them make those links. But it's not easy, and I would say this is perhaps even a slightly more familiar market than going into Indo-Pacific market, for example. But as a government, what we do is we lay the foundations. We put trade agreements in place. We try to remove regulatory barriers. We coach them. We introduce them. But you fundamentally, at the end of the day, private enterprise is private enterprise. They decide where to go. I think that maybe in a few years, the numbers will show that we have actually shifted to new markets, because I think the barriers now are real, and the sense of betrayal that kind of pushes in behind will potentially fuel some more enterprises to look at new markets.
Yeah, so maybe I can comment on the pessimism, optimism. Half full. This would assume that it is not the Trump administration and its framing of the transatlantic relationship and these ruptures that are causing this division of values within the transatlantic, but it would assume that it's rather the demographic shifts that are causing this, right? It's not Trump, it's the demographics. And even if there was another Biden and then Harris and another Harris, we would be drifting apart, right? So this would also assume that the new generations and the immigrants do not have, and it's a very complicated kind of moral debate, right? But that the new generations do not have the same values and do not cherish the same values of liberalism and democracy that the generations after the war, which have built the transatlantic ties, did, right? And this is where my optimism still comes, right? That those are so strongly embedded in the American civil society and in the American public philosophy, right? That they will survive this, even this demographic shift, let's say, right? And I know we have spoken, and I have also said it to the media, that Biden is the last transatlantic president, meaning in the culture of transatlanticism that comes from the Second World War, where they were people who themselves fought in Europe, whose fathers or whose grandfathers fought in Europe, who were the second or third generations of Europeans. So they still had family in Europe to go back to. And this is what formed the necessary kind of connections, right? And I understand that the demographics is changing. Those ties, those people-to-people ties, or let's say the blood lines, let's say, or the blood ties, they are kind of, pulling apart for demographic reasons, not because and not because of Trump, right? So I would still stick to my optimism that these values, that universal aspect of some of those values, is at the heart of American society, and we could get so deep into this discussion, so I'll leave it at that. But just regarding CETA, I think the EU, again, because of its power, of its huge market, right, does sometimes is not a fair trading partner at certain points, and not towards Canada, right? So agricultural exports was a big thing, right, in CETA. There were, economists were estimating that there's up to a $600 million market for beef in Europe, right? The numbers are at about 20 million, right, for 5 or 6 years past when CETA comes into place. And one of this is, again, there's increasing regulation that is being imposed after the fact of CETA, that does not, labeling and all of these kind of very technical small issues that dissuade the private investors and the private, exporters and the importers on our side, to get Canadian beef, for instance, right? Which is delicious, right? But again, it's Ireland, right? Irish beef, that is going to dominate the markets here, obviously, right? While at the same time, Canada is really, for instance, European cheese is flooding. It's flooding Canada, right? And so there is a discrepancy. Canada is a population of 40 million. There's a market of 40 million. European Union is a market of 450 million, right? So the power of the European market is just too big for even like middle powers and partners who we consider, to be on our same wavelength. The Europe still uses this power to kind of, I don't want to say extort, right? These states, but that's the power of the market, right? So we are living in a way in a transactional world, right? But Europe just doesn't say that it's also using those tactics sometimes, even towards our partners.
I'm glad you said it.
Someone had to say it.
There's still 10 countries that have not ratified CETA as well. So 10 out of 27.
But this still means that it's in place because
it's in place, so they can benefit, but there's no ratification. It's rather strange.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have more questions? Yeah, they're in the back.
Thank you. I'm Martin. I'm a student at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles. We've been talking about transatlantic relations as a very integrated, I would say, concept, as a unitary concept. And as a very convinced Europeanist, I would greatly love for it to be the case in reality. But when we look at Europe, it is becoming quite obvious that we are slowly but surely going into a huge political crisis. In almost each of the countries, a very right-wing populist, Trumpist, I would even say, party is rising steadily through the polls. And in this one, has even claimed the reins of government this weekend. And all of these parties that are probably going to increasingly take part in European governance have very different views on transatlantic relations than the current European establishment. I would say many are sympathetic to Trump. And I'm not sure in that context how sympathetic to Canada they will be. So in the context of this possibly very shifting mechanics of politics on the ground in Europe, where Europe will quite possibly be not very united or maybe shift its position in time completely, how does that play into these things? Is Canada as a country counting with these things? Is it the possibility that is being considered, or are we just hoping it's not going to happen? Thank you.
Yeah, we just hide in our igloos and hope it won't happen. It's great. No, I mean, yes, we reported on the election results from this country from the weekend. We're certainly watching very closely, and we monitor what's happening not just in the EU but across Europe. Certainly, there's some big vectors that we pay attention to. Russian influence, other states influencing and interfering in the process of democracy, the rise of disinformation and manipulated information, the rise of extremism, whether it's far right or far left. These are all kind of flags that we watch for and monitor and discuss with our partners in many different fora. So, yeah, of course, we pay attention. We also we respect the democratic will of the people. I think election observers in this country, for example, there were no major discrepancies reported. It was a free and fair election. People exercised their right to vote. Their voices were heard. We don't always agree. I mean, I have my own personal political opinions, which I don't share on stages with microphones. But of course, I've worked with and for governments who I don't necessarily agree with all their values. I think, to your point, though, when we're moving into an atmosphere where there is this rise of sort of the protectionism. And I spoke of it in my opening remarks, there's this sense of a real transactional, bilateral kind of relationships are being prioritized over these bigger institutional or multilateral relationships, or, EU to Canada, or the Transatlantic family, or NATO, or whatever it is. That's not our position. And so that's where we just keep trying to have conversations, open doors. When there are more transactional political parties in place, we'll transact with them. We're not going to die on some values-laden slope. We want to ensure that we also, at the end of the day, we have to put our own needs ahead of others at some point. So we do look at things from a pragmatic lens as well. There are, as I was saying earlier, when there are issues you can agree on, then you work on those issues together. We want our relationship with Europe to work. We're invested in our relationship. We want to understand it. We want to support it. We want to help with whatever we can. So I think it's about coming at it not from a black and white sort of lens, but also, a little humility and kind of recognizing where you have a right to kind of say something and where you also have a right, where you just want to be engaging as well with countries. So, I don't know if I share your totally bleak outlook. I think there's still a lot of conversations that are happening, and there's a big difference between sort of populist rhetoric winding people up and what actually happens in a practical day-to-day relationship that we have as diplomats behind closed doors, that we have government to government, that we're not necessarily projecting to the world because it maybe doesn't benefit some of the more populist leaders to be like, actually, yeah, it's totally fine. I'm going to agree to this, right? So there's a little bit, you also have to separate a little bit some of the vote-winning rhetoric that you hear versus the actual, like, what you have to do when you get down to a negotiating table. But, we don't live in an easy world anymore. The 80 years post-war, the rupture has happened, not the rapture, the rupture. And here we are. So, not yet. Jeez, I'm not sleeping tonight.
Maybe just a quick note. I think that's your question kind of falls into this theme of the recalibration, right? The kind of pro what we would say like these Trumpist parties around Europe, or that are on the side of the culture wars, that is also the side of, Trump and his administration. That is, for good or for worse, that is part of this recalibration of the values and the ideas that bind kind of the transatlantic area, right? And maybe we will find ourselves being bound by, and this is the other bleak part, bound by more of a Trumpian kind of vision and values, right? But these will still have that kind of backbone of democracy and liberalism, right? And one of the reasons why that is also happening is, if you look at how closely we watch in Europe, and in this country in particular, how closely we watch the U.S. presidential and midterm elections, right? How the debates from the U.S. are reflected here so much, and in every European country, right? In the U.S., the news doesn't cover, elections in Europe, or who's the European Commissioner, right? So through this coverage, through our interest in the United States, we're also kind of importing a lot of the cultural war components, a lot of the rhetoric, right? And that is an unnecessary thing in a way, right? But our curiosity in what's happening in America, right? A lot of the people in this country, without being curious about the U.S., know a lot about the elections, and because it's so prevalent in our media, right? And particularly because it's Trump, right? Trump he is clickbait in Czech media. Right? Anything that Trump says, and any newspaper editor or online newspaper editor would tell you, anything that Trump says, we got to put it up because that's clickbait, and we get ad money for that, right? So in a way, we are, forthcoming to that. We're kind of bringing it in because we're so curious about it. The Americans are not doing it the other way around. They don't care about what we talk about and who governs here, but we care about what's happening in the U.S. And thereby, implicitly and indirectly, we are engaged in, and we're slowly importing those debates and even the negative sides of them. Right. So that's that kind of recalibration that I had in mind, and you put a little bit more of a kind of specific, touch to what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the question, because I realized that in the two options that I presented at the beginning, there was basically an assumption that on the European side, we will always have the values of liberal democracy, but the US is the question mark, but actually that's not a given, right? So that's thanks for the question. Yeah, I see one more there.
Hi, I'm Bram, a European politics student. You were talking a bit about the rules-based order. I think the US has had a big role in ensuring this world order, and is now walking away from it, sometimes being explicitly against it. Professor Hornat, you were saying that the EU cannot, or is not really fulfilling a role in ensuring this world order, and maybe Canada can. But will Canada be powerful enough military or economically to be able to fulfill that role? Or is there a different actor which might fulfill this role? Or will the US keep fulfilling this role somehow? Or is this just a bygone era?
Thanks. So what I meant is, the EU and Canada, for instance, joining hands in, protecting what's left of the rules-based order and advising on some reforms, right? But I see, the connections can go further, right? To ASEAN countries, right? To East Asian countries. African countries have always been left out of this, So in terms of, upholding the rules-based order, perhaps the EU could be a leader in assembling these coalitions, right? And I do not see that kind of leadership, because the EU at the same time is in a clutch with the, with the United States, trying not to bother the snake too much, right? So we are tiptoeing and being careful, right? Because any kind of activity historically, even by the Europeans, to assemble themselves and become more autonomous on the United States has always been met with critique on the part of the Americans. So on the one hand, we always hear, Be more responsible for your defense. But when in the 1990s, the Europeans start talking about a common security and defense policy and common foreign security policy, that's when the Americans say, hey, are you trying to substitute NATO? And Europeans say, no, we're just trying to be more autonomous. And be careful about that, right? Then Europe comes up with PESCO. And again, the Americans are saying, what is that? What initiative is that? You're leaving us out of your defense and security mechanisms. That's not the deal, right? So the Europeans always have to kind of balance this out, right? And perhaps that's one of the reasons why a stronger push towards, really, and WTO is one of the big, organizations that really need a reform, right? And during the Biden administration, the Europeans in joint communiques, they have always spoken about we need to work on a joint proposal for WTO reform. That never materialized. Perhaps it was because of the Biden administration, but the Europeans never came up with their own project, right? Von der Leyen spoke about an alternative to WTO, but without any other follow-up or any other specificity. So I don't see the EU taking that role, unfortunately, right? Maybe it's just waiting, right? What will happen? And if Trump goes away, then all will be back to normal. I doubt that it will happen. But that's where, for me, the EU is failing in this kind of leadership of upholding the rules-based order, right? Because it is slipping from our hands. It is. Right, the rules are disintegrating, right, and there's no strong actor that can uphold them. China wants different types of rules. Maybe it's fine with certain trading rules, but it wants different. It has the capacity to change them or to be the leader. But if it were the leader, it would want a different system, right, than the current one, right? So I think that kind of alliance, let's say, of like-minded states that don't have to be, sharing similar values or identities, but that are sharing the necessity of a rules-based multilateral order. That is something that would be difficult to assemble, but will work. There's so many international organizations that are stalled either by U.S. inactivity, defunding on the part of the U.S., critique on the part of the U.S. Look at ICJ, the International Court of... Look at the ICC, right, which is an incredible development for international law and international criminal law. The U.S. has been bashing it since the beginning, right? But the U.S. is in a position where it can afford to do that and shape the entire global debate about these organizations.
Thank you. Maybe one last quick question, if there is still interest. And if not, I would perhaps give the floor to the speakers still to give a few closing remarks, if you want to. Who wants to start?
Well, no, I think I've spoken far too much. Just wanted to say thank you very much. I hope it was interesting and informative. And, it's such a broad topic to talk about our transatlantic relationship. But I think if you have one takeaway, it's that, A, it's a lot more complex, but B, there's not just one country across the ocean. And I'm only talking about Canada. You have Mexico, and then there's 30 plus countries down south of there. And there are, you didn't mention the Americas as partners, but, I talked about Brazil, but you have Peru and Chile, and there's a lot of other medium-sized economies chugging away, trying to figure out what we do next. So for the young people in the room, don't despair. All is not lost. And I think in all my years of diplomacy, if I've learned one thing, it's that you don't only talk to your friends, you talk to everyone, you try to understand them. And that does help you find a way to move forward. And I try to remain optimistic in that regard. But thank you so much. It's been really great to be here. And I will stop now.
Yeah, so I would just join in thanking the organizers. I've also spoken enough, and thank you all for coming and for your interest in this very complex topic. But with these discussions, I think we can all sort of calm ourselves down. That there's light at the end of the tunnel. So thanks. Have a great evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the director of Campus Hybernská, Tomáš Vokáč, I would like to thank our excellent guests, Her Excellency Madam Emily McLaughlin, Dr. Jan Hornát, our excellent moderator, Štěpán Vizi. Of course, I would like to thank our technicians and my colleagues that helped us to organize this event. And of course, I would like to thank you. You were an excellent audience. And because you were an excellent audience, I would like to invite you to have a modest refreshment in the other room, and you can continue in the discussions, having a glass of wine or something. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the evening.